everyone, Amelia here. Thank you so much for watching my channel. Please give me a thumbs up if you like my videos, and also don't forget to subscribe and sign up for my email list. The link for my email list is down below. Today we're doing a little bit of a different format. I'm talking about transitions, and first I'm going to go through some PowerPoint slides. If you are on my Zoom call on Sunday, this will be a good recap for you. First, I'm going to go through some slides, and then I'm going to show you a video of me doing some transitions and how I use them to school my horses. I have been doing these Zoom calls every Sunday, so if you want to join those live, make sure you're on my email list. And if you'd like to see the recordings of some of my previous live calls, be sure to support us on Patreon. Patreon is a great site where you can donate a small amount monthly to help me keep making these awesome videos. So give me a thumbs up and let's get started with this. So in dressage, transitions are everything. Dressage is really about practicing these transitions and being able to do them seamlessly and flawlessly so that you and your horse are in perfect harmony. There's a German quote that says, training occurs in the transitions. You train your horse through transitions, and that's also how you get them strong and more supple and more collected and more engaged. So transitions are everything. So what is a transition? According to just like a Webster dictionary, a transition is the process or a period of changing from one state or condition to another. Now, a dressage transition, I just made up this definition, but a dressage transition is a seamless change from one gait to another, or a change of tempo within the gait with invisible aids from the rider and no disruption in the horse's balance, harmony, or frame. So in a dressage transition, we're really working towards that. Very little aid from the rider so that it looks effortless and like we're doing nothing. And then from the horse, that the frame stays the same, that they really engage and use their hind end and their core and their back in the transition and stay supple and soft through their neck, and their frame stays the same. Why are transitions important? So transitions are everything, really. So here on the right, we have a training level test 3, and I've circled in red all of the transitions that you get marked on. So obviously you enter working trot, halt, proceed working trot. So already there in the first movement, we have 2 transitions. We have to get from trot to halt and back to trot. And then we have a transition to working canter, transition back to trot, transition to medium walk, and then we have transition from medium walk to free walk, from free walk back to medium walk, and so on. You'll also notice that some of the transitions are coefficients. So the transition from working canter to working trot is worth double. It's a coefficient. So how many transitions are in training level test 3? 9 of the 15 movements at training level test 3 are transitions. And there are a total of 11 transitions in training 3 that are called for. Now, obviously, you're going to be doing other transitions. So you may need to go a little forward within the gait or a little half halt, depending on what your horse needs. So those are only the transitions that are called for. And in training 3, these transitions account for 59% of your score. So even though, you know, the millisecond that it takes to go from trot to canter is very small, this is a really expensive millisecond in your test. And that's why practicing these transitions are so important. On the bottom left-hand corner, there's a picture of me and Natasha piaffing. And in the Grand Prix, there's something like 26 transitions, because in the Grand Prix, you have passage, piaffe, passage transitions. And that doesn't even count for all the other transitions that you need to do, because you need to do a transition from collected canter to pirouette canter, back to collected canter. So there's a lot more even than 26 in the Grand Prix. So that's why you should practice your transitions. Okay, so in the transitions, only the legs change. This applies to both horse and rider. So on the bottom here is a photo of me riding Kensington. He's the new horse that I have. He's 5 this year. But the basically below the red line is indicating that for Kensington, when I do a transition, only his legs should change. So if I go from trot to canter, only from the line down should change. From the line up, I want his frame, I want his balance, I want that all to stay the same. It's just the gait that is changing. And the same applies for me as a rider. When I ride a transition, I think of the transition happening from my waist down. So my aids for the transition are basically from my belly button down. I shouldn't do anything abrupt with my shoulders. I shouldn't lean forward or lean back. My hand should stay relatively passive. There shouldn't be a big change at all in my hands. So the hierarchy of transitions. This basically is going from the most basic to the most advanced transitions. And it's important to understand this hierarchy so that you know what's important to work on with your horse, what's appropriate to work on with your horse, what's good to work on in the warm up, and then what's good to work on later on in your ride. So at the top here, the most basic transition, in my opinion, is the trot, walk, trot. This is a good transition to start with if you're a green rider or if you have more of a green horse, because it's the most simple. Then we go to trot, canter, trot. The canter transition is more complicated because in the canter transition, we're dealing with different leads. In the canter transition, you have to coordinate your outside leg behind the girth, weighting your inside seat bone, a half halt, and all of that. So that's a bit more complicated. But the trot, canter, trot transition is still considered a basic transition because it doesn't require collection. So it's a good transition for the warm-up phase of your ride or if you are doing the lower levels. Then we have a walk, halt, walk transition. I put this one farther down because the halt can be a tricky place where horses can get confused and worried. When we ride a halt in dressage, we need the horse to stay on the bit and connected so they're ready to walk on. So in dressage, a halt isn't just like let the horse stand on the buckle and flatten. They need to stay kind of in frame and engaged in the halt. And sometimes they can get anxious and worried when you ask them to stay together and stand still. And then we have working trot to lengthening trot, or also working trot to lengthening canter. These transitions show up at first level, and it's more of a basic transition because it doesn't involve collection. So the bottom half of this slide shows transitions which require collection. And in these transitions, you're normally skipping a gait. So we have trot, halt, trot with no walk steps. We have rein back to trot. That's a great one because the rein back gets the horse's hind end under and engaged, and then they're more able to push off and stay engaged into the trot. We have canter, walk, canter. That's one of my favorite ones to work on to develop engagement and collection in the canter. And it's also a great one to work on building up strength in your horse's hind end. Collected trot to medium trot, walk to piaffe, medium trot to passage, and then passage, piaffe, passage. So all those ones at the bottom are obviously Grand Prix transitions. Passage, piaffe, passage is one of the hardest transitions. I don't know if you guys have ever watched the upper level international Grand Prix competitions, but it's very typical that those passage, piaffe, passage transitions are really tricky even for the best horses and the best riders in the world. Okay, so this is a transition ladder, and this was just something I made up as a helpful visual for you guys to understand the basic versus the advanced transitions. So you can see the basic transitions that we are always start with on a young horse are where you just go up one rung at a time. So when you're warming up, or if you're working with a green horse, you're going from walk to trot, trot to canter. So you're going or canter to trot and trot to walk. Then as you get to be more advanced, you start skipping a gait. So the more advanced horses, once they learn collection, you're going walk to canter, canter to walk, and you're skipping the trot. Now, it's important that even if you have a more advanced horse, that you still work on the basic transitions, because the canter trot transition shows up at the Grand Prix. So just because you're doing collection, you still need to work on the basic transitions every day. Transitions and the training scale. So part of the reason that transitions are so difficult and so important in dressage is that they test all of the rungs of the training scale. So we'll start with rhythm. And when you're riding a transition, it's important that you maintain the rhythm of the gait. So it's really important to maintain the clarity of the gaits, of the rhythm of the gaits in between transitions. Suppleness, so that refers to the relaxation and also the elasticity of your horse's muscles. In a good transition, your horse stays relaxed, so they're ready to respond to your small aid, but they also stay relaxed, and they have that elasticity in their muscles so that their top line stays engaged, and they kind of stretch their top line muscles during the transition. Connection refers to acceptance of the aids, so acceptance of the bit, that the horse stays connected in your hand. In a good transition, there should not be any more or less pressure in your hands. If you have 4 ounces in both hands before the transition, that should be the same during and after the transition. Impulsion, obviously working on getting more suspension and lift in the canter strides. Straightness, if your horse has a straightness issue, it's going to be worse in the transition. If your horse likes to fall to the right, they're going to do that a lot in the transition. So that's a big test in your transition. And then obviously collection. Transitions are a great way to develop the collection, and they also really test the collection. So in order to be able to do a canter walk, your horse really has to be able to collect and engage their hind end in order to get right from canter to walk with no trot steps. Common mistakes in transitions. So some of the most common rider faults that I see is, number one is the ineffective rider. So often I see riders that kick 3, 4, 5 times, whip their horse a few times, and nothing happens. So your job as a rider is that you always want to start with a small invisible aid and then do what it takes to make the transition happen, and then repeat that transition until your horse does it from a very small and subtle aid. Another one I see is either leaning forward or falling back in the saddle. I can't tell you how many people I see that they go to do an upward transition and they tip way forward, but this really doesn't help your horse go. The only thing that leaning forward does is it puts more weight on the forehand. So don't do that. Another one is pulling. So a good transition is really done from your seat. In the downward transition, absolutely you need a little half haul, but it needs to be kind of half haul give, or a little shoulder forward, yielding, but not just pulling. And another one that I see is incorrect timing. So it's really important the timing of when you ask for a transition, particularly the canter transition. So I think of kind of trot, 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 canter. I don't get too like wrapped up in which leg is where, because I just find that that causes paralysis of analysis. But the timing of when you ask, that you ask in that trot, 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 canter rhythm is really important. And then some of the common horse faults are that the horse will either pop their head up or drop their pull too low. So they'll either hollow and put their head up, or they'll drop their pull too low. In both instances, the horse is not wanting to use their hind end and their core in the transition. They're wanting to kind of use their neck and lift themselves into the transition. No reaction to the rider's aids, we talked about that. Losing impulsion. So in a downward transition, it's really important that your horse keeps its energy up, So they need to keep the high energy. They need to stay stepping forward and downward and really stepping with their inside hind leg through in that downward transition. And then straightness or not maintaining tempo. So that's another one, is tempo. It's really important that the tempo doesn't change before the transition. So it should be like a steady trot tempo, trot, 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 canter. It shouldn't be trot, 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 faster, canter. And again, if the tempo's changing before or after a transition, it's because the horse isn't really using their top line or their hind end properly. So the aids for an upward transition, halt to walk, both legs driving at the girth, using the calf, lighten the weight on both seat bones, softening of the reins to allow an opening for the horse to move forward. It's really important in these upward transitions that you're not driving and pulling at the same time, nor do you want to completely throw the reins away, but you do need to open the door a little bit and allow your horse to step forward. So it's just that feeling of having a forward feeling hand that allows your horse to step forward. And I really, for my upward transitions, ideally, it's just your calf. If your horse doesn't respond to your calf, then you may need to like kick them and make a big point of it, and then go back until when you close your calf that they go forward. Now the trot to canter, you can see this is where things get really complicated. In the trot to canter, we have inside leg at the girth, outside leg behind the girth, more weight on the inside seat bone, slight positioning of the inside rein to the inside, half halt on the outside rein to set the outside hind leg as the first beat of the canter, and the inside rein giving a little during the transition to canter. So you can see that the canter transition, because there's all these directives, and also in the canter transition, every horse and every rider is a little different. So that's why a lot of horses and riders struggle with this transition. Now, downward transitions, I think, are actually harder than upward transitions, because in a downward transition, you have to think of a forward downward transition. So I kind of think of an airplane landing. If you think of how an airplane lands, they land with their back wheels first and their nose up. So this is kind of like, even though the horse is decelerating, we really want to maintain that engagement of the hind end and that shoulder uphill so that they don't do a nosedive and crash. That's a really good visual to have in your mind to get this forward downward idea. So like an upward transition, a downward gait transition should feel like it starts from the horse's hindquarters. And again, it's that engaging of the hind end and lowering of the hind end that's so important, that our plane doesn't crash. Because if the horse stops behind, they're going to go on the forehand and they're going to do a nosedive, which if your horse is a plane, that's going to end very badly. So it's almost like in a downward transition, you have to kind of rev the engine up and get more energy in your horse before you ask for the downward, so that you have that engagement of the hind end. So a walk halt, we have increasing weight on your seat bones. Your seat stops following the motion into the halt. You tighten your lower abs. And then into the halt, a little leg to encourage the horse's hind end to step under. Same thing with the trot walk, except in the trot walk, it's really important that you don't completely stop your seat. So unless you're doing a halt transition, your seat actually has to stay moving forward with the horse's motion. So your seat will change from like trot to walk or canter to trot, but your seat is still moving forward. That's really important. How much weight, leg, and rein you need in these downward transitions really depends on your horse. If you have a lazy horse, you're going to need more leg in the downward transition so they don't just stop on you. If you have a hotter horse, you may need a little more of seat and rein to get the horse to come back to you. And that's just where it depends on the horse, or it may even depend on the day. But that's where it's so important as a rider that you can feel and adjust based on what your horses need at the moment. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is that the quality of all of your transitions depends on the quality of the gait that you have before the transition. So if your horse isn't really through and they're not really round and they're not really forward, your transition is going to be bad. So if you want to make your transitions better, really focus on the quality of the gait before, during, and after the transition. So just because you're working on transitions, you also need to really work on the quality of your gaits between transitions, and that's going to help to improve your transition. So often, like if I have a bad transition, let's say I do a trot canter and my horse kind of pops its head up and inverts, I will keep going in the canter and try and fix it in the canter by making my canter quality better, making the horse a little rounder, really engaging the horse in the canter. That's going to help. So next, I have a little video I'm going to show you guys of me riding. I'm going to talk you through just doing a ton of transitions with Don Carlos and how I do them in my work, how they help my horse. Also, don't forget to check out, there's this full lecture is on Patreon. And when I did it live, we had a lot more interaction and a lot more questions. So be sure to check that out. And thanks for watching.
Okay, so I'm going to start my warm-up with trot canter trot transitions on a circle. And that was my first canter transition. You could see he put his head up, and it wasn't the most fluid transition, which often for the first time you pick up canter in your ride, it isn't. So I just tried to make him round and forward once I got in the canter. And then there I made a nice canter trot. You could see that I am using a little shoulder fore and yielding his hind end out after the downward transition. And then that upward transition was really, really nice and smooth. I'm really focusing on the quality of the trot and the canter in between the transitions, because the better the quality is of my gait, the better the transition. And then that was a better canter trot. With Don Carlos, he's a little downhill, so I'm really trying to help him stay uphill in these transitions. And that canter trot again was really smooth. You could see his frame stayed the same. My position stayed the same. I didn't lean forward or pull my hands up or do anything crazy. And I start these canter trot canters at the beginning of my ride on the circle just because it's a little more simple, and I can use the bend and the shoulder fore on a circle to help keep my horse's inside hind leg engaged. So now we're going to do some trot walk trot transitions. And same thing, I'm starting them on a circle, and I'm really always trying to feel what my horse's inside hind leg is doing during the transition. So I want the inside hind leg to step forward and under during the transition. So here again, I'm using a little shoulder in, shoulder fore to guide that inside hind leg forward and through. I'm thinking about stepping him forward from my left leg and into my right rein in both the downward and the upward trot walk trot transition. And that was nice. You can see I'm also thinking about the rhythm. So I want to go from a nice rhythmic walk right to a nice trot without any kind of lateral walk or slow trot. That's really important, that you go right from walk to trot. And then that I'm focusing on keeping him round. That was a nice transition. It looked like he really listened to my seat in that transition, and I didn't really have to use my reins too much. And that's really important in your downward transitions, that you think about trying to use your seat and a little yielding off the inside leg rather than just simply pulling back onto reins. It's important too to make sure you do your transitions in both directions so that you're working both hind legs evenly. So then once Don Carlos is a little more warmed up, I'm starting my walk, canter, walk transitions. And these transitions are where we start with the collected work. Because we're going right from walk to canter, we're skipping the trot, which means he has to collect and engage. So here I'm collecting, and I'm going to make a transition to walk. And again, you see how I placed that right hind leg a little over. Especially I did it a little more after the transition to really help him understand that I want him to stay engaged on his hind leg through the transitions. And the walk canters are really good on him. The canter walk, that was pretty good, but you can see he has a little tendency to want to dive down in front and fall on the forehand, which is why I'm doing a little bit of shoulder in after the transition to re-engage that inside hind leg. And that transition wasn't very good. You could see I had a few trot steps before he walked, but the walk to canter on the left lead now was good. So again, make sure you practice these transitions on both leads, and do them on a circle at first to help you. That was better. When you're doing these transitions, you really want to try to get right from walk to canter and canter to walk with no trot steps. And that can be tricky, but when you're showing second level, the judge does not want to see any trot steps in your transitions. Okay, so now I wanted to show you a few trot, halt, trot transitions. And so in the trot to halt, your seat does stop a little. But you'll see in this first transition isn't very good. So you saw he dropped his pole down and he backed up in my halt. So that tells me that I used too much rein and not enough seat and leg. So this time I thought of using a little more leg. You see how he stepped forward, but then he stepped back again. So I need to work on these with him. It's really important in dressage that your horse stays forward thinking in the halt and that they don't back away. With him, he has a little tendency to want to duck down and back up in the halt. So I want to really make sure that he steps forward and keeps his pull up and his croup under into the halt. That was better. That was better. And I just have to figure out, every horse is a little different, and this horse needs a little more seat and leg into the halt so that he doesn't back away in the halt. That time was better. If your horse tries to back up in the halt, just simply send him forward again and then halt again with a little bit less rein and more seat and leg until they understand to just halt and stand still, and really be sure to reward them when they are standing still. That was better. So now I am going to ask him for rein back. Rein back to trot is another great transition that you can incorporate. The rein back really helps get the horse's hind end engaged so that when you trot off again, your horse has an engaged hind end. So again, rein back, same thing in the rein back. I want his pull to stay the same, not too high or too low. So the end. Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video.